The interstellar Concordance had spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of unnecessary complexity, so naturally, when Treaty Station Epsilon-7 lost primary power during the most delicate trade negotiations in a generation, nobody had bothered to install a backup generator that actually worked. This was the sort of oversight that earned entire oversight committees, which would eventually form subcommittees, which would then draft proposals for feasibility studies on preventing future oversights. Meanwhile, 17 highly decorated officers from 4 different species were discovering that universal translators functioned beautifully in the cold, which meant they could all perfectly understand each other's complaints about freezing to death. The station had been constructed at the midpoint between 4 territorial zones, floating in the kind of empty space that made philosophers wax poetic about the void and made engineers check their oxygen readings twice. It was diplomatically neutral, technologically advanced, and currently colder than a bureaucrat's heart. The environmental systems had failed first, followed by the food replicators, then the emergency food replicators, and finally the emergency ration dispensers, which had apparently been installed by the lowest bidder and maintained by the second lowest bidder's incompetent nephew. Commander Zreth of the Kari Diplomatic Corps stood motionless in what had been the main conference chamber, his 6 legs locked in a stance that suggested either deep meditation or rigor mortis. The Kari were an insectoid species known for their logical minds and impeccable military records, qualities that were currently worth absolutely nothing against simple thermodynamics. Being cold-blooded in sub-zero temperatures turned out to be one of those evolutionary quirks that fancy spacesuits couldn't quite compensate for when said spacesuits were designed for short-term exposure, not 3 days of bureaucratic abandonment. The relief vessel, Zreth managed through mandibles that clicked sluggishly, was due 47 hours ago. "Your grasp of time remains impeccable," Officer Mindros observed from her corner, where she'd dimmed to barely a flicker. The Vethran were crystalline beings who existed on a spectrum between matter and energy, which sounded impressive at cocktail parties, but meant precisely nothing when the power grid died. Without electricity to supplement her natural luminescence, Mindros had faded to the color of old dishwater and radiated all the warmth of a philosophical debate about ontology. Lieutenant Corvin of the Dulrathi delegation had managed to wedge all 4 of his arms into his thermal suit, which made him look like a very depressed balloon animal. The Dulrathi were amphibious, possessing 3 separate stomachs designed for 3 separate types of nutrients, which meant Corvin wasn't just hungry, he was hungry in triplicate. His species had colonized 17 water worlds and mastered biological engineering to the point of casual arrogance, yet somehow none of that helped when the molecular restructuring units that made their specialized food had stopped restructuring molecules. "We could attempt to reroute power from the emergency communication array," suggested junior analyst Thexin, a 4th species present in mercifully smaller numbers. The Sin's people, the Morathi, had 12 fingers and loved pushing buttons, which made them excellent technicians and terrible people to invite to museums. "We attempted that," Zreth replied in the tone of someone explaining basic arithmetic to a rock. "Twice. The array's fusion cell is depleted. We could sacrifice the distress beacon, but then rescue vessels would have nothing to lock onto except our frozen corpses." Always such an optimist, Mindros flickered weakly. The remaining officers had clustered in various states of misery throughout the station, each convinced that their particular evolutionary advantages would somehow trump physics if they just believed hard enough. The Kari contingent had tried forming a heat-sharing cluster, which worked brilliantly until they realized that 6 insects at 0 degrees simply made one slightly larger 0-degree insect formation. The Vethran had attempted to meditate into a lower energy state, essentially planning to hibernate through the crisis, but kept getting interrupted by their own survival instincts rudely insisting they not slip into the eternal slumber. Corvin had tried eating his uniform belt. It had not been nutritious. "Perhaps," he said with the desperate optimism of someone 3 days past rational thinking, "the supply runner will bring something." "The supply runner," Zeroth clicked, "is human. They will bring protein paste and synthetic water, and absolutely no understanding of our sophisticated nutritional requirements." At this point, Mindros dimmed even further, which should have been impossible. "I would consume fossilized plant matter if it prevented my matrix from crystallizing permanently." As if summoned by the magic words of rock-bottom expectations, the outer airlock clanged. Everyone who could still move turned toward the sound, which resembled hope wrapped in rusty metal and desperation. The human who cycled through the airlock looked thoroughly unimpressed by the tableau of alien suffering before him. He wore a maintenance jumpsuit that had seen better decades, carried a toolkit that might have been assembled during Earth's Industrial Revolution, and possessed the expression of someone who'd just arrived at a party where everyone was complaining about problems they'd created themselves. "Huh," the human said, breath misting in the frigid air. "This is what an interstellar incident looks like. Thought there'd be more fire, less whining. The environmental systems have catastrophically failed." Zeroth began with as much dignity as a freezing insect could muster. "Our replication technology is non-functional. Our power cells are depleted, and yeah, I can see that." The human was already moving through the space, running his hand along dormant wall panels and kicking the base of the dead replicator with the scientific precision of someone who fixed things by hitting them. Power relay blew out, took the primary distribution node with it, and your backup system never engaged because someone installed incompatible firmware during the last update. Silence greeted this assessment. "That's impossible to determine without diagnostic equipment," the Sin protested weakly. The human tapped a wall panel which sparked feebly. "Nope, that's just what happens when you design systems so complicated that nobody understands how they work anymore. You get really good at fancy stuff and really bad at basics." He glanced around at the shivering, dimming, deflating assemblage of galactic authority. "How long you been without heat?" 73 hours, Corvin provided, all 4 arms wrapped around himself. "Damn. And food?" "The replicators ceased functioning 60 hours ago." The human did some mental math that apparently involved counting on his fingers. "So you're cold, starving, and waiting for someone else to fix it. The rescue vessel ain't coming for at least another 2 days. There's a solar flare between here and the nearest outpost. Nobody's flying through that." The human set down his toolkit with a thunk that sounded inappropriately cheerful. "Good news is you got me. Bad news is I'm human, which means you're all about to learn what primitive solutions actually accomplish." Zeroth's mandibles twitched. "We appreciate any assistance, but our biological requirements are quite specific. You need heat and food." "Well, yes, but then sit tight and try not to die for about an hour." The human disappeared into the guts of the station with the confidence of someone who'd decided that regulations were more like friendly suggestions. The aliens exchanged glances that ranged from skeptical to desperately hopeful, which was the emotional equivalent of checking if the life raft had holes before jumping off the sinking ship. "Do you think," Mindros ventured, "that humans actually possess some solution we haven't considered?" "Humans," Striff said carefully, "are known for their improvisational capacity, also for their alarming tendency to solve problems through methods that violate several laws of safety and common sense." At this point, Corvin rumbled, "I would welcome a violation or two." The sounds emerging from deeper in the station suggested that the human was indeed violating several things, possibly including the laws of physics. There was banging, the whine of tools that shouldn't work without power, more banging, what sounded like creative cursing, then a triumphant shout followed immediately by a yelp and more cursing. 30 minutes later, The human emerged carrying what looked like a metal box constructed from a heating duct, part of the wall paneling, and what might have been the casing from a defunct atmospheric processor. He'd also collected various odds and ends that had no business being near each other: insulation foam, a length of power conduit, and someone's decorative desk fan. "What?" the kin asked with genuine curiosity. "Is that oven?" The word translated, but the meaning didn't quite land. Ovens were ancient heating devices used by pre-industrial civilizations who hadn't yet discovered the joys of molecularly restructuring matter into whatever form they desired. Ovens were museum pieces. Ovens were what you read about in anthropological surveys with an amused sense of superiority. Ovens were not solutions. "You're joking," Struff said flatly. "Nope." The human was already setting up his contraption in the middle of the conference room, running the power conduit too. Was that the emergency lighting circuit? Got the heating element from the backup thermal regulator that nobody bothered maintaining. The chamber's insulated with fireproof foam from the wall cavities. And this, he patted the box affectionately, will get hot enough to cook just about anything. "We don't have anything to cook," Mindros pointed out with impeccable logic. The human grinned, which exposed his teeth in what was probably meant to be reassuring but mostly looked feral. "Check the emergency supply locker, the one marked human consumables. Been there since they rotated me through 6 months ago." Corvin, motivated by hunger that transcended dignity, retrieved the mentioned locker. Inside, wrapped in primitive polymer containers, were substances that looked disturbingly organic. "Flour, salt, water, and some dried yeast I've been keeping viable," the human explained, firing up his oven, which hummed to life with a confidence that all the advanced technology had lacked. "Basic ingredients. Humanity survived thousands of years on this stuff before we got fancy." "You're going to make bread," Struff said slowly, the way one might identify a particularly confusing abstract sculpture. "Yep, bread is a pre-space flight food." "Yep. We are officers of the interstellar Concordance, and you're hungry." The human was already mixing ingredients in what looked like a repurposed storage container, his movements quick and practiced. "Bread's got carbohydrates, proteins, fats. It's nutritionally complete enough to keep you alive. It's hot, and it tastes a hell of a lot better than whatever synthetic protein paste you people pretend to enjoy." The mixture came together under his hands, transforming from disparate elements into a cohesive mass that he kneaded with rhythmic efficiency. The aliens watched with the fascination of anthropologists observing a ritual from a primitive culture, except this ritual was being performed for their benefit, and they were too cold to maintain proper scientific detachment. "The fermentation process," the human continued, apparently enjoying his captive audience, "is where yeast consumes sugars and produces carbon dioxide, makes the bread rise, gives it structure. It's chemistry, biology, and physics all working together through processes humans figured out before we even had written language." "Fascinating," the Sin murmured, genuinely interested despite himself. "A living organism produces the desired reaction. Life making food for life. Poetic, right?" The human shaped the dough into a rounded form and set it near the warming oven. "Needs about 30 minutes to rise, then another 30 to bake. Try not to die of anticipation." As if on cue, the oven's warmth began radiating outward, a gentle heat that felt like the physical manifestation of hope. The aliens, despite their various physiologies and cultural backgrounds, all migrated closer to the warmth with the inevitability of moths to flame, except much slower and complaining less. Zurith positioned himself at the optimal heat absorption distance, his exoskeleton beginning to lose its alarming rigidity. "I must admit, the thermal efficiency of this device is Adequate. Adequate, the human snorted. Buddy, humans were regulating temperature with controlled fire before your ancestors crawled out of whatever primordial soup produced giant space bugs. We're really good at making things hot. Mindros had brightened to approximately the luminescence of a depressed flashlight. The principle is sound, even if crude. Crude works when fancy fails. The human checked his dough, which had indeed begun to rise, puffing up with visible enthusiasm. That's the thing about complexity. More parts means more ways to break. This oven's got maybe 7 components. Your replicator's got what? 7,000. 17,432. The sin corrected automatically. And how many of those are working right now? Pointed silence answered that question. The human loaded his risen dough into the oven with a gentleness that contrasted with his earlier rough efficiency. Almost immediately, a smell began to permeate the cold station air, a warm, yeasty, impossibly comforting aroma that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to something primal in every oxygen-breathing organism present. Corvin's 3 stomachs growled in harmony. "What is that scent?" Mindros asked, her crystalline structure literally resonating with interest. Bread baking, Maillard reaction, caramelization, all sorts of chemistry producing aromatic compounds. The human inhaled appreciatively. "Smells like home." The smell intensified as minutes passed, transforming from interesting to tantalizing to absolutely maddening. The aliens, who had spent 3 days maintaining dignified suffering, began to crack under the assault of actual sustenance being prepared before them. Their advanced civilizations had given them sophisticated palates, accustomed to precisely calibrated nutritional matrices and flavor profiles designed by master molecular gastronomists. None of that preparation helped against the raw, fundamental appeal of fresh-baked bread. "How much longer?" Corvin asked with the restraint of someone hanging on to dignity by their fingernails. 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes stretched like temporal anomalies, each second weighted with hunger and anticipation. The oven's warmth had spread throughout the chamber, raising the temperature to merely uncomfortable rather than lethal. Officers who'd been scattered in suffering had congregated into a loose semicircle around the improvised bakery, watching the human tend his creation with an attention usually reserved for first contact scenarios. Finally, mercifully, the human opened the oven. The bread emerged golden brown, crusty, steaming, and looking absolutely nothing like civilized food. It looked rustic and primitive and real in a way that molecularly restructured nutrition never quite managed. The human set it on an improvised cooling rack, really just a section of wire mesh, and produced a knife from somewhere. "Give it 2 minutes to set, then we eat." Those were the longest 2 minutes in Treaty Station history. When the human finally cut into the loaf, the crust crackled with a sound that every being present would remember for the rest of their lives. The interior was soft, airy, and still steaming. He tore off portions with his hands, primitive and direct, and passed them around to outstretched appendages, crystalline extensions, and grasping limbs. Zereth, who had maintained perfect military bearing through combat, diplomatic disasters, and 3 days of freezing starvation, brought the piece of bread to his mandibles with trembling limbs. The taste bypassed his sophisticated Kari sensory processing and hit something much older, much more fundamental. It was warm, substantial, and real. It was survival. Corvin devoured his portion with all 4 hands, no longer caring about protocol or dignity, or anything except the miracle of hot food filling his 3 empty stomachs. Mindros absorbed her share through direct molecular integration, and brightened immediately to something approaching her normal luminescence. Around the circle, Alien officers who represented the pinnacle of their respective civilizations ate bread torn from a single loaf, served by a human who'd built an oven from scrap, and discovered that advancement had not, in fact, made them superior to hunger. The sin began, then paused to take another bite. This is actually quite good. Bread's been good for about 10,000 years, the human replied, cutting more slices. You people just forgot. They ate in silence, which was probably the most sincere compliment any chef could receive. The human had baked 2 more loaves by the time they'd finished the first, apparently anticipating the appetites of the starving. Each officer received enough to satisfy their immediate hunger, with extras set aside for the remaining personnel scattered throughout the station. I suppose, Zarif said eventually, having recovered enough function to remember his rank, we owe you considerable gratitude. You owe me a functioning station to resupply, the human corrected, already disassembling his oven to salvage components. And maybe a bit more respect for primitive technology that actually works. The rescue vessel will arrive in approximately 48 hours, Mindros noted, her natural color fully restored. Your solution has bought us sufficient time to survive. My solution, the human said, is keeping you comfortable. There's a difference. Corvin, feeling charitable with all 3 stomachs full, asked, where did you learn to construct such a device? YouTube videos and summer camp, mostly. Plus about 100 failed experiments in my garage. The human packed his tools with practiced efficiency. Humans learn this stuff young, because you never know when civilization's going to fail, and you need to know how to not die. An admirable philosophy, Thusen admitted. A necessary one. The human headed toward the airlock, then paused. Listen, I'm leaving the oven intact, and the remaining supplies accessible. If anything else breaks before rescue shows up, don't try to science your way out of it. Just remember, heat rises, fire needs oxygen, and bread takes about 30 minutes at medium temperature. Caveman knowledge, but it works. He cycled through the airlock and was gone, leaving behind a warm room, full stomachs, and 17 highly educated officers contemplating uncomfortable truths about complexity versus competence. The rescue vessels arrived 43 hours later, navigating through the clearing solar flare with appropriate caution. They found Treaty Station Epsilon-7's personnel alive, warm, and significantly better fed than expected, given the circumstances. The official report mentioned emergency protocols, improvised solutions, and interspecies cooperation, but somehow failed to include specific details about bread-based salvation. Commander Zarif filed his assessment using all the proper military terminology and diplomatic language, carefully avoiding words like oven and primitive, and humiliatingly effective. His superiors read between the lines anyway. They hadn't survived decades of bureaucracy without learning to interpret creative omissions. Officer Mindros returned to her duties with renewed appreciation for backup systems, particularly ones that didn't require firmware updates to function. She also requisitioned a copy of human survival literature purely for academic interest, and definitely not because she'd discovered that bread was delicious. Lieutenant Corvin maintained his dignified bearing and impeccable service record. He also, in moments of private reflection, acknowledged that his 3 stomachs had never been more satisfied than when filled with food made by manual labor and chemical processes that predated spaceflight. He did not mention this in his official reports. He did, however, begin a quiet campaign to include human-style emergency rations on all Dalrathi vessels, framed as efficiency improvements rather than admissions of inadequacy. Junior analyst Thexan wrote a paper on improvised thermal regulation using pre-industrial techniques. It was rejected by 3 journals for being too simple, which rather proved his point. 6 weeks after the incident, a package arrived at Treaty Station Epsilon-7, addressed to maintenance section. Inside was a formally sealed message from the Carry Diplomatic Corps, thanking the human staff for their assistance during recent difficulties. Attached to this official correspondence was an unofficial note, written in Zarif's precise handwriting. The formula for your bread has been entered into our cultural database. We are informed this is how recipes are preserved among your species. It seems appropriate. Also in the package, sealed in an airtight container designed to preserve organic material for decades, was a single slice of bread. The molecular analysis tag indicated it had been thoroughly scanned, tested, and documented before preservation. Someone had kept a piece from that original loaf, studied it with the full resources of Carry science, and then saved it anyway. The interstellar Concordance continued its mission of connecting civilizations, negotiating treaties, and maintaining the complex web of relationships that kept 1,000 species from mutual annihilation. Their technology grew ever more sophisticated, their protocols ever more refined, their solutions ever more elegant. But on Treaty Station Epsilon-7, and gradually on other diplomatic outposts where stories spread through the informal networks that every military develops, something shifted. Emergency supply lockers began including flour, salt, and preserved yeast alongside the molecular paste and synthetic water. Training protocols added sections on thermal regulation through combustion. Engineering courses reluctantly admitted that sometimes a hammer and determination accomplished what a diagnostic suite could not. Humanity, with their suspicious talent for surviving conditions that killed more sophisticated species, had taught the galaxy an uncomfortable lesson. Progress meant building upward from foundations, not forgetting those foundations existed. Complexity was impressive right up until it failed, at which point simplicity became salvation. And bread, primitive, ancient, made from ground plants and microscopic organisms and controlled heat, tasted exactly as good as it had 10,000 years ago, which was apparently something that molecular restructuring had never quite managed to improve upon. The human maintenance technician continued his supply runs, unaware that he'd become a minor legend in diplomatic circles. He fixed things, delivered materials, and occasionally baked bread when stations lost power, treating each crisis with the same unimpressed competence. After all, when your species had clawed its way up from caves to starships through sheer stubbornness and the systematic application of hitting things until they worked, a little thing like interstellar diplomatic incidents didn't warrant much fuss. Besides, he had 17 other stations on his route, and at least 3 of them had broken environmental systems that needed the kind of fixing that came from a toolkit and common sense rather than a computer degree and wishful thinking. Somewhere in the cold vastness of space, bread rose in improvised ovens, heat radiated from scavenged components, and humans continued the ancient tradition of making civilization work through methods that sophisticated species had forgotten to remember. It was primitive. It was crude. It was inelegant and simple, and beneath the dignity of advanced galactic society. It was also warm, filling, and kept people alive, which turned out to matter significantly more than sophistication when everything else had frozen solid. The galaxy remained vast, complex, and full of wonders that required tremendous technology to navigate. But now, at least in certain circles, there was also the understanding that sometimes the most advanced solution was knowing when to use the oldest one. And really, nothing else smelled quite like fresh bread.